Everyone, this is Max at MaxUTCG. Thanks for joining me in another video. So this was a video that I put up as a potential discussion video in the community tab. There are subscribers for the YouTube channel got to vote on this. Let me know what you guys think of the visuals, if you like this kind of way of explaining the deck and kind of making it easier to understand, and if the visuals help, and if you just like it aesthetically. It does take longer to make this with visuals than if I just do a raw kind of more discussion video, even if I jot down points and kind of have things planned out. So let me know if you like this approach, or if you just rather have more raw videos. So what we're going to do is look at what makes a deck good, and we're specifically talking about the Snak-Eye cards, because I think there's some unique aspects to the Snak-Eye cards that I want to break down. And we'll kind of go through this kind of in-depth process, breaking down the Fire King Snak-Eye, Pure Snak-Eye, some differences, what makes them good, and really trying to understand that from a well-rounded discussion point, because I think that's really important. You can easily look at a deck and be like, oh, it won a YCS, it's good, or it's topped a bunch of regionals, or YCS tournaments, nationals. Like, you can look at tournament results and realize that deck's decent, but I think what's important is if you can understand what makes cards good and decks good before that, you can better prepare, and it'll make you a better player if you can understand why the deck's good and not just understanding it's good from results. Right, so these are kind of the areas that I look at when breaking down a deck and seeing how good it is, and this is kind of the order I go in. Right, so just kind of break through, more of a discussion on these cards. So the strategy for Snak-Eye, we have monsters in the spell and trap zone. That's kind of the more gimmick or play style of the deck, is it's meant to put its own cards or your opponent's cards in the spell and trap zone. As a form of removal, that's actually a pretty good effect, because it's pretty hard to get cards out of the spell and trap zone. For most decks, not putting it back in the graveyard is really good, since most people can access their grave, or they even play out of their grave. So that is a decent way of playing in terms of strategy. It's a very monster summon heavy strategy, which can lead to issues in the OCG where they have maxi, where we don't have that. So that's kind of changed some of the way our decks are doing well in comparison to the pure versus Fire King version. It does a lot of link climbing. Because it's so monster heavy, you can play into a lot of different links, and there's no real restrictions on the cards, which make it really good for doing link climbing. And then it has solid recovery. You can do a lot with the Flameburst Dragon going to grave, which can get 2 bodies that both search cards. So you have solid recovery and pretty solid grind game with either version of the deck. And then again, you have quite a few spots for tech cards, or just kind of empty slots after you fill out the main engine of the deck. The Fire King version can probably fit between 12 and 15, depending how slim they're getting on some of their engine cards. And the Snak-Eye version can get anywhere from 18 to sometimes 21 after sighting. So just play a ton of hand traps to stop your opponent, which is part of the problem in this format. Alright, so when we look at kind of the Fire King version, we have our engine, so this is going to be using Snak-Eye Ash, Onyx, Original. There's going to be a mixture of cards. I'm only throwing a few up here just to kind of show some distinguishing points between the two, but deck is very good. I think right now it is kind of losing to the pure version. I think that's for a few different reasons, and we'll kind of get to that when we're going through the deck. But again, it's still a solid deck to play. I think the difference between this type of deck, though, is this deck I think does have a little bit more of a push, but does have to play more cards because of that. And some of the way this deck plays in comparison to the pure version, I think does make it worse because of what it loses to. The M board cards, a lot of times they're using IP Masquerena, they're kind of Princess Engrave, the Fire King deck. Some people are even cutting this for space, but it does have an Exceed that works with its Fire King to nuke the board. So there are a lot of ways you can kind of vary your interruption and where it's happening at. They can kind of go for 2 different approaches, either hand traps or board breakers. One thing really big right now is hand traps, because of how much the deck does off one Snak-Eye Ash in either version of the deck. A lot of times it's easier to stop them from playing than it is to try to break the board, stop the follow-up, and be able to play. Because a lot of times, even if you break the board, if you don't kill either version of these decks, you will lose on the crackback when they get to play, and they can generally pull off very easy OTKs. And I think that's why we're really leaning toward hand traps right now. But generally, board breakers are, I think, a more fun approach, more interactive approach. But the other thing you have to consider with board breakers is the amount of time. When you stop your opponent from playing with hand traps, you have more time to play. When you let your opponent combo for 5 minutes, and then you try to play, and then you let them combo again for another 5 or 10 minutes, that eats up a lot of time on the clock. It can result in you going into time more. Things to consider. Next we have the pure version. So the pure version is a little different because it focuses more on synchros. But even some people, due to the heavy hand trap count, aren't even playing the synchro version, they're just playing links. I think to some extent it's good to play the Jet Synchron, because when you do get to combo off, the synchros are kind of, I think, what make the deck better, because the Fire King deck has a lot of varied disruption, but doesn't have any hard negates. The pure version can make 2 hard negates with Borreload Savage Dragon. It can end on also going into a Baronne to floor. So there are ways you can go into multiple negates, playing around cards like Super Poly. So you can do a lot, and I think the ability to do that is one reason why this deck is a little bit harder to go against, because board breakers aren't as good since they do have the hard negates as they are against the Fire King deck, and the deck plays a ton of non-engine, generally more than the Fire King deck, so it's also good at stopping it. So I think those two things kind of combined together are what's making this deck better for us. Now in the OCG they have Maxi, which might make the Fire King version a little bit better there, and it's been doing more than the pure, but both decks are still doing good in either format. Alright, so next we're going to overpower, and kind of what I ask myself when I'm thinking, is this deck good? So how good is the M board? And does it do anything unfair? Again, generally I'm looking for power, I'm basing it off what the board is doing. Ideally you want to be able to play going first, and if you go uninterrupted when you go first, generally speaking, you'll probably win. Now, depending if your opponent's playing board breakers or hand traps, if they have a lot of board breakers or certain engine cards or the right hand, they can play through it. But generally, when someone goes first and they make their full board, you generally do win the duel. And does it do anything unfair? There are decks that are decent, but they unfortunately, don't do enough. And a lot of times, what makes the best decks the best is that they do something unfair. Sword Soul is looked at as a very fair deck for what it does. And what made it unfair was Protoss, but once Protoss got banned, it kind of lost that unfair element. It kind of lost a lot of its power from being able to lock your opponent out of the game. So when we look at some of the stuff this deck can do power-wise, it can do a ton. 7-8 interruptions, some different combos here I'll kind of go over that you can do. You already, drew a card off Heat Soul. You recurred a Kirin back with the Fire King combo because you have the Great Sunlight Wolf. You have the Flameburst Dragon that can bring out the IP that can link away into an SP or an Apollousa. The Heat Soul will draw you another card in your opponent's turn. So you literally used 1 card. Now you have 6 in hand, and you're going to have 7 on your opponent's turn. So you're going to have more cards than they do. You're going to have follow-up with the Flameburst when it goes to grave. You have Princess in grave. So this combo isn't necessarily good because of what it loses to, but a lot of the combos for this deck can do so much off 1 card, plus having other cards in hand as well. So kind of when you put all that together, it is very scary. So this one is a 1-card Ash. This is good game 1 versus hand traps. Different lines you can play with Apollousa and Ambler Whale, which is nice in the Fire King deck, even though this is being more cut in the pure. You have ways to bring back cards. You potentially bring back Arvata, doing a board wipe. You have a lot of different options here off 1 card. Again, you're still going to have 4 cards in hand, which is really good. Next, you have 1-card Ash Anti-Nibiru, so there's ways you can play around Nibiru with the Fire King version, which is nice, as well as with the Snak-Eye version. So you can either play around or play through, which is kind of really scary since the deck has that option. You have a 1-card combo through Droll. So that's one thing. Everyone thought Droll was going to be good, and generally when Droll's good in a format where everyone's searching like crazy, it can generally shut down a deck. But against this deck, you can still make pretty much the full board. Have 4 cards in hand, and your opponent just lost a card, and you still have a lot of interruption. Again, plays through Droll, can play through Nib, kind of the big blowout hand traps that's already looking good while still making a board. So there's different options. You can use Pitknight as ways to play with the deck. It has a anti-super poly combo that it can do. So depending on what board breakers you think your opponent's using, if they are going for board breaker approaches, because that's more popular in the meta, you can really cater your board to avoid some of these options, which is nice. The specifically nice thing about this is that you have 2 negates on the Apollousa, and you have a way to stop them from just attacking over the Apollousa because of the effect Ambler Whale has during the battle phase to pop a card. Plus you have other ways to revive cards and make plays. So there are some really nice aspects to the way this deck works and can play around different things. We have a 1-card Ash combo through Cosmic. So one thing with the last combo is it does lose the Cosmic Cyclone because you have no fires on the field for Princess. These get wiped that is really scary. But they can go for another line with the Fire King board that can put the island back into the deck using Unicorn. And because island only triggers when banished or destroyed and sent to the grave, sending back to the deck actually doesn't trigger the effect. So you can actually make it so they can't just board wipe you by cosmicking your field spell. And you can still end on multiple negates, plus so much follow-up and other interactions that you can do. This is a 2-card Ash plus original. So this is anti-cosmic, but the 2-card version, which gives an even crazier board that you can play through than just with the 1 card. And then when looking at the Snak-Eye deck, there's different options that you can go for with this. You can make Baronne, while still having 4 cards in hand, and having the setup with Flame Burst to bring cards back, and Princess, and a potential pop off the Zelantis. Plays you can do there. You have a 1-card Ash combo of IP, so you can use the Apollousa, Flame Burst, and IP to go into cards like SP, and make more of a link play versus like the kind of synchro focused. And then you have some really nice 2-card combos that the deck can pull off with Ash and Wanted. Any combination of this with Bonefire and Ash, or Wanted, or the Black Witch, can make Baronne plus Savage. And there's different ways they've gone about making this board. Originally, the board used to be with like IP and the Borreload Savage Dragon, but that's 2 darks that can be super polyed away for Mud Dragon, which is still decent in the fire matchup, but not necessarily the win con that it usually is. But now people have been playing around it where you don't have the ability to go into Mud Dragon or Garua, and really the only card that hits this is Panzer Dragons. That's something to consider, is that there is a super polytard for this board, but it's not as commonly played and not as good. And you can avoid getting hit with the Draco quest that people used to do when they would, use the Boral Savage and then, bring out the Barrone, so that Barrone and Borreload Savage that can hit by Super Poly. Now people are playing around that card. All right, so that kind of goes over the power. So the deck has a lot of different lines and options. It's very versatile. It can adapt to what's popular. You can do different boards. It's kind of hard to know which board they're going to go for, unless you've already kind of seen that board in game 1, where what's popular, but this changes and adapts. So the deck has a very high power level. All right, so next we have consistency. How consistent is the deck? And can it use generic consistency cards? So with the general consistency, we're looking at how many cards it has to start its plays. Does it have search cards to get to these cards? Are there generic cards that can be used? So let's kind of look at that when it comes to the Snak-Eye cards. I think this is one thing that gets maybe kind of understated or not understood, especially by maybe newer players or less experienced players. It's how good the consistency cards are in this deck. So every card in this deck outside of Ash, which is like a perfect 1-card combo, you can do everything with this card. And again, this plays around Droll. This is amazing starter and extender for the deck. But these cards here that kind of get to all these, Bonefire is a superior starter. 1-for-1 superior starter, Wanted superior starter, Diabellstar superior starter. So one thing that's important, I think, to realize with this is, decks have card rules, which kind of focus on what the card does, necessarily for what the card is. So these are all monsters and spell cards, but yet they all kind of start your plays. And the nice thing is usually a starter is something you have to play to start your plays. An extender is something you use to play through disruption to keep playing. Now, a superior starter is something that lets you play as a starter or extender. It can do either. And that's a really powerful card because now you're not stuck to just one rule. If you draw too many starters and they stop your play without an extender, you can't keep pushing. And if you draw too many extenders, sometimes you don't have enough to actually get your play going. So with this deck, what's crazy is there's so many cards that are superior starters. You can do them for either. Bonefire can get you a Snak-Eye Ash to start your plays, or you can search Populous to play through your Snak-Eye Ash getting hit with a Infinite Impermanence. 1-for-1, again, similar card, can get Ash to start your plays as a special summon, so you don't even waste your normal summoning this, or you can get Poplar as a special summon to extend out as long as you have a monster to send to the grave. And most people playing a lot of hand traps, you'll generally have a monster. So Wanted is just a way to get to Diabellstar, but it gets you an extra draw, which is really nice. And Diabellstar is a easy way to just summon onto the field, search the original and get to Ash and start playing, and that's without using your normal summon. So there's so many ways that these cards can either start your plays or extend. I think that's a huge benefit to the deck, and most decks don't have this when it comes to their consistency cards. Usually they'll have a starter and a couple starters or ways to search the starter and like maybe 3 superior starters that can kind of go either way, but this deck has so much and quite generically like kind of merging together, that it really gives this deck, I think, a boost, and that's one of the reasons why this deck is so good. So when we look at the kind of probability of drawing cards, so generally speaking, there's about 13 starters. It gives you about an 87.73% chance to draw your cards. You usually want about 11 to 13 starters, sometimes more. If you add Poplar in, and you count that adds 2 copies of Poplar, pretty standard to play in the decks, in either copy. That gives you a 91.93% chance. And usually this is more when you're thinking about the pure Snak-Eye deck. The pure Snak-Eye deck can play better off Poplar than Fire King can, even though the Poplar is definitely the weakest starter as a starter. It's much better to play as an extender. And then next we have 2-card combos. So it has about a 33.91% chance to 43.87% chance to be able to do 2-card combos. So if you're just looking at it as a straight 2-card combo, you need 2 cards to make a board like the synchro boards that the pure deck makes. That either requires Ash, Bonefire, or 1-for-1. And then you either need Wanted and Witch. And you just need one of these options to be able to play. And then, if you're kind of more thinking of it, well, what's my chance of drawing 2 cards to play through hand traps? What's my chance of getting Ash, my main starter, and my other cards to be able to play through my Ash getting stopped? That's where you get more into the 43.87% chance in a 40-card deck to be able to play through at least 1 hand trap. So generally, it's why we're seeing such heavy hand trap counts, because 1 hand trap is not generally enough, especially depending on the deck. They can either have the extenders, or in this Fire King deck, they can potentially use Kieran to pop a card, and that will make it where, an effect negation card like Effect Failure or Imperm, will miss the Ash. They get the Ash to go through, they get an extra body, and they pretty much just played around you while having an extender. It's important to kind of think through these and figure out what makes your deck good and how to calculate it. Now, if you don't know how to calculate this, what I'll do is I'll cut to a seed where you can kind of see some different deck builders, and I'll show some examples of what you can consider using and why, and we'll just do that quickly. And if you want more of an in-depth analysis of this in its own video, I can definitely do that as well. Right, so I'm going to show some of the probability calculators you can use. This one is Duelist Unite. I like this one the most because it gives you the option to better calculate your percentages. I think other deck building options do. So one thing you can do with this is you can just type in all of the cards that are something you're looking for, so in this case starters, and just see what's your chance of drawing at least one of these cards. About 87% chance when we do 13 possible options, we're getting at least one, 87.73. Now if you're to say, okay, well what if I want to have 2 of these? You get about a 53% chance, but that doesn't consider duplicates. So you can do 2 Snak-Eye Ashes, doesn't really help, with playing through card. 2 Bonefire doesn't really help because you already used one. So it's a little skewed in terms of, not every 2-card combination out of this is going to be playable. That's why I like what you can do with these is you can say, okay, well, these are the cards I want out of group 1. These are the cards I want out of group 2. And if this card can search in either group, you can use it as considered a searcher. It's only meant to be used when it can access 2 cards of a group. So in this case, we want to see what's my chance of getting Snak-Eye Ash. So this is for kind of playing through the hand trap 2-card kind of situation. If you have Snak-Eye Ash, and then you want to have cards that can get you to original. That's Wanted, that's Black Witch. Now, cards that can kind of get you to original either way are Bonefire and 1-for-1, or it can get you to Ash. So Bonefire and 1-for-1 can get you to Ash directly. They can also get you to Poplar. If the Ash gets stopped, which gets you to 1-for-1, and both of these cards get you to original, which can get you to Poplar. So in this situation, you have a 43.87% chance, which is a nice thing to be able to understand. That's not the same as having a 50% chance to open either of these. And then you can consider, well, what's my chance opening up the synchro combo with the pure deck? I have my options are Snak-Eye Ash and Bonefire. That's what I need out of one side of the cards, and out of the other side of the deck I need Wanted and the Diabellstar package to be able to pull out the combo. So in that case, if you do get stopped with a hand trap, most likely unless you have a third card to be able to extend out, you are, depending on where they stop you, you're not going to be able to pull out the combo if you get hand trapped for like the synchro line. You'll have to go for more and I'm just going to play through the hand trap approach. So that's why I really like this deck builder. I think it gives you a little bit better numbers, and you can do some calculations the other ones don't let you. Another one that's pretty popular that people use is the hypergeometric calculator. This lets you kind of type in different aspects of your deck to see what the percentages are. So if you have a 40 card deck, which is a population size, number of success in population, this is the amount of total cards that kind of meet the card rule. So in this case, we're saying what's the chance of getting a starter? If I have 13 starters, my starting hand is 5 cards, and I'm trying to get one of those starters, I have at least an 87% chance of getting one or more. So this is the number you want to look for when you're using this calculator. But again, it really is only good for getting the starter cards. If I were to type in 2, it's going to give me that same percentage as the other option, 53%. But again, that's not counting for duplicates. That's why, again, I like using the other one more. And then another option that you can use is Yu-Gi-Oh! Probability Calculator. This can be nice if you're trying to work out your deck and figure out what's my chance of drawing these cards together. This one works okay if you're trying to figure out card combos, like the synchro line where you want the Ash and the Witch combo together to be able to pull that off, or if you're just trying to figure out starters. But again, it isn't going to help you if you're like, well, what's my chance of getting 2-card combo off? Again, 53% chance, not considering. So we can go through these more in depth if you want, but I think that gives a pretty good cover of how these work, and we can discuss probability calculators and thinking through deck building in other videos as well. So next, what's really important to consider is resilience. I think this is a really important part. Can it play through disruption? Can it play through hand traps? Going first, does its end board have layered disruption? So these are, I think, really the key component of what makes a deck meta. When it starts going through some of these specifics, is resilience. Now, a deck can be, have a good strategy and be pretty powerful. It can be pretty consistent, but it doesn't play through hand traps that well, or it doesn't play through certain board breakers. This kind of part is what makes a deck separate itself from being good and being tier 1, the best deck in the format, or one of the few best decks. And usually when decks get hit after they've been the best deck, they kind of lose this resilience, the ability to play through cards, because that's what's kind of frustrating with Snak-Eye. And this is probably what we're going to see throughout multiple ban lists as the deck gets hit and eventually made worse, that it will lose some of its resilience, which is why it's so good. Can you play through disruption? You can play through board breakers, you can play through hand traps with the deck, it's really good. And does it have layered disruption? So again, the layered disruption is the idea is, are all my kind of points of interaction in one spot? When they're in one spot, it's a lot easier to deal with. When we look at, again, resilience, varied areas of interaction. And again, the more spread out it is, the better it is. And you have 4 total areas. Most decks use 2 to 3. Now, technically, there could be more with the Banish Zone, but generally speaking, these are the 4 areas that are the most common. You have the Monster Zone, which are usually like monster effects on the field. You have your hand, which is hand traps, like I said, it's 3. 2 Spell and Trap Zone, so maybe like a searchable Omni Negate or searchable trap card that you can play in your opponent's turn. And then you have the Graveyard. And usually, most decks will play with 2 to 3. The best decks would generally have 3 to 4. So we're kind of looking at the cards that give the deck resilience. So one, for the Fire King version, you have Kirin. This lets you play through targeting effect negation. You have the Pure version, you have Temple, and even some Fire King versions now are actually playing Temple as an option as well. This is nice because it lets you put Snake-Eyes in the Spawn Trap Zone. A lot of times you can put Flameburst, or you can put Snake-Eye Oak into the Spawn Trap Zone depending on the line. But the nice thing is in the Pure version, you can put cards in the Spawn Trap Zone. So if you get nibbed, you can play through it. It gives you recurable options, to kind of keep playing, which is nice. And this gives you ways to summon those monsters out. So it really pairs well with Flameburst Dragon, especially in a grindy situation. Next, you have Promethean Princess. Again, another really great card. It does so much for the deck. It can be an extender to get more monsters onto the field, way to play through cards, since it can bring itself back. And it's also disruption, so that way, when your opponent tries to summon a monster, you can pop your fire monster and their monster, summon to the field. Next turn, it's follow-up to keep playing. It gets stun on your turn when you initially summon it. Again, just an amazing card. Could definitely see this card getting banned at some point, but I think it will be around for at least a little while. Apollousa, another really resilient card. Now, Apollousa by itself really isn't a problem, generally speaking. Most decks can play through an Apollousa. Apollousa becomes a problem when you're using it early to be able to insulate your other combos. Apollousa with other cards on the field, I think, is where Apollousa becomes a problem. and maybe we'll see this card get banned eventually due to that. It is getting reprinted in the Rarity Collection 2 they're doing, so I doubt that's going to happen right away, but maybe eventually we might see this card banned, because depending on the way it's being used, really depends on how broken this card is. And then we also have Called By and Talents. So these are the ways to kind of make your deck more resilient. Called By can hit different hand traps that go to the grave to let you keep playing. Talents is another card you can play when you get hand trapped to look at your opponent's hand. You'll maybe take their starter or take another hand trap out so you can keep playing if you could already push through one. So really good cards. Talent is also a solid card for going second, being able to steal your opponent's cards or draw you into more cards if your hand's not that great, to keep pushing. Called By can also be used going second, but it kind of depends on the format and the deck. Called By is generally a much better of a card when you're not using it in a fire deck, since usually the card you want to hit is Princess. And when you're in a fire deck mirror, all the cards you want to hit are going to hurt you. But again, really good resilience cards. So next we have end board resilience. So these are ways in which the deck can play through board breakers or other cards that are trying to kind of break what it's doing. Again, Apollousa are ways to negate effects. Overload Savage is a negate, same with the Barrone that they can summon. IP Masquerena, is a way to potentially dodge target negation. If you use another effect and they try to negate it, you can link IP in that monster away. Summon an SP, summon an Apollousa. You'll have more plays. The IP gives it destruction immunity, which is nice, which can be a way to play around Princess if that's in your opponent's grave. Princess, another, again, really good resilience card for kind of everything that it does as an extender, disruption, and follow-up. Alright, so next we're going to look at follow-up. How good is the deck at setting up follow-up if their board is broken? So again, this is their ability to be able to play. If your board gets broken, usually you're going to be able to search another starter from your deck or recur a card from your graveyard to use to start your plays again. And do you have enough resources in your extra deck in your deck to be able to make your board a second time? Or do you have enough to be able to push for game that turn if they can't kill you? That's kind of what we're looking at here. So when we look at follow-up cards that the decks have for either the pure or the Fire King version, you have Flameburst Dragon, that will get you Snake-Eye Ash and Poplar, or Snake-Eye Ash and Oak, which can get Poplar, or you can get Ponix in the Fire King version. So there's different cards you can get to that will search you extra cards to kind of follow up with on the next turn, which is one reason why this deck is so hard to deal with, is that if you don't kill it, you're probably going to lose. In the Fire King version, you have Runick, which is a great card for, as long as a fire monster is destroyed, you can bring this back from the grave, and then this card can destroy a card from deck, which will give you more interaction and more follow-up. You have Divine Temple of the Snake-Eye, again, a really good card in a grind game or for follow-up against your opponent. Fire King Island, another way to be able to have follow-up. This card can be used again on the following turn to destroy a card and, trigger more effects. Sunlight Wolf is a great way to get follow-up. It's a way people get to their Kirans, have extra plays. It can be a way to, if you summon a monster, you can get your Ponix, you can get your Ash, your Oak. You can get different cards back to your hand to use again. So the deck has really nice ways to get follow-up. And then next you have Grind Game. Your Grind Game, how good is the deck in a longer duel? Can it play in a simplified game state? So a deck with good Grind Game isn't necessarily required anymore. If you look at a deck that used to be tier 0, we have Dragon Rulers. That was a deck with great Grind Game, and at the time, no deck grinded like that deck. Nowadays, in more modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, Grind Game is more of a nice thing that a deck has, but it's not necessarily unique to any specific deck. A lot of decks can have it, and having a good Grind Game does not mean that your deck's going to be good. This is kind of more the cherry on top kind of situation. The more minimal thing that you want to have for a deck to be, top tier is that it's going to be able to record some follow-up. But a lot of times when you get that follow-up, you just kill the next turn. So you don't need to grind out, to turn 7, 8, 9, 10 potentially. The Runick Bestial deck that Josh played, that had really good grind game and follow-up. So, that deck could go to a simplified game state and do really well because of its constant resource regeneration. But again, that's not a requirement for a deck to do well. Labyrinth is a deck that has really good grind game, but sometimes due to not doing enough going first, or being a little bit of a slower deck sometimes because of trap cards or not having good matchups, makes it unfortunately not always the best deck in the format and doesn't always do as well as people might. So when we look at the cards that have grind game, and again, follow-up and grind game could be a little different. In the previous page we had Sunlight Wolf. I consider that more of a good card for follow-up, but not necessarily grind game, because a lot of times it'll probably die. You're probably not going to get it back again. So it's really only going to do its purpose of getting you the card for the next turn, but it's not going to grind in simplified states over and over. Where like Flameburst Dragon can get you cards, could generally get that card again from having extra in your deck potentially, or reborning the card with Princess. There's a lot of ways that this card becomes grindy. And in a more simplified state, Runick is a great card in a simplified state. Any fire monster gets destroyed, it brings itself back, destroys a card from deck. You can destroy Kieran, pop cards. There's a lot of really nice options for that. Temple, I think, is a solid card in a grind game still, because you can put Flameburst into the small trap zone. You could then summon Flameburst out, and then Flameburst can also summon other monsters out of the small trap zone. So you can kind of create a loop where Flameburst can put cards into the small trap zone and steal your opponent's cards for you to use in a kind of grindier setting. Garunix, the Hyung of the Fire Kings, the XYZ has effects that when it's destroyed, gets more monsters, which is great for OTKing and follow-up. And again, Princess, another really good card for follow-up and OTK and extension. Alright, so next what we're going to do is, because I'm talking about how great the deck is, I want to talk a little bit how to counter the deck. And this is, again, part of the problem with the deck and why we're in like this tier 0.5, tier 0 format. So hand traps versus board breakers. Generally you want to commit to one or the other. Sometimes you can commit to either depending on the deck, what board it's making. Sometimes a hand trap and a board breaker actually pair well together going first or second. So that's kind of when you're seeing more mixed approaches to it. But right now, I think we're really in kind of a one or the other. You either go full hand traps because you want a critical mass to stop your opponent, or you go all board breakers and you're not really trying to stop your opponent. You don't want to play into talents. You don't want to play into call by. You don't want to play into cross out. You want to just let your opponent play and break the board. Right? How much room for tech cards? So decks that have a lot of room for tech cards can naturally thrive in hand trap formats. Some decks like Branded Despia, for example, is a deck that's doing well this format, due to it being one of the few decks that can break the Fire King board, that can grind with the Fire King deck. And that deck doesn't generally have a lot of room for hand traps, so it kind of has to go for more board breaker approach. And you can utilize some really nice board breakers to be able to push through plays and really get to a lot of their key cards. Can you deal with follow-up? So this is one of the scary parts of the deck, is that, again, a lot of times you might be able to break the board, but if you can't kill them, the amount of follow-up the Fire King deck gets, it will kill you. And then can you OTK this turn? And again, this is part of the follow-up. Sometimes if you can't deal with the follow-up and you can't OTK, you're going to lose. And again, that's really the struggle, I think, for a lot of rogue decks going against the Fire King deck. All right, so now we're going to discuss some of the countering options with specific cards. So one approach is hand traps. So these are the most common ones people are playing. Most people are playing Ash, Imperm, Effect Failure, and Nibiru. These are kind of the best 12 cards when it comes to generic hand traps that work well in most formats, and they pair well together. Usually an Ash and an Imperm will stop the Snak-Eye deck. Imperm and Nibiru will stop the Snak-Eye deck, and sometimes even Imperm and Effect Failure can potentially stop the Snak-Eye deck. And then as the 15th card right now, we're kind of seeing Droll as that 15th card. Droll can pair also with other cards. A lot of times, the Snak-Eye deck can play through Nibiru, can play through Droll. You cannot play through both. Sometimes even double Droll can stop your opponent. So these are kind of the 15 cards people are using when they're using the hand trap approach. And a lot of decks are maining 15, where usually when you have a hand trap deck, you want to have a minimum of 12. That gives you about a 50% chance, not considering duplicates, to kind of stop your opponent. And generally speaking, 2 hand traps will stop most decks in the game. So here we have more hand traps. So the decks that are taking the hand trap approach are citing even more hand traps. We're seeing Mourner as another effect negation hand trap. We're potentially seeing DD Crow and Bell. Bell can stop the Wanted card as a starter, but it can also stop recursion. But a lot of times DD Crow and Bell kind of act later in the turn. So to some extent, these might almost be better as like board breaker hand traps. Starts to get rid of the Promethean Princess or stop a revive from grave when going second, than necessarily a card that pairs with the first sets of hand traps, because those are more meant to stop your opponent from playing. We're also seeing people see Bestials because you can hit different cards from the grave. Link Karibo, potentially IP Masquerena. You can stop the Borreload Savage from getting the Link Karibo equipped so it doesn't have to negate. You can stop your opponent from doing things, even going second potentially, depending on how their board's set up, from reviving certain cards. So you can hit the Witch. So there are options. The Bestials that are nice since they are also bodies on top of a removal from graves. So that's kind of where you might see people kind of shift between these, is kind of depending on what you want. Do you want the pressure that the Bestial gives, or do you want maybe the diversity that these cards get, even though they're a little bit more low impact? We're also seeing people playing the Cyframe package, Gamma, and I think it's the Epsilon one that negates the spell cards. So because Gamma's at 1, a lot of people don't want to play 1 Gamma and 1 Driver, since that's a 1-to-1 brick ratio of 1 good card, 1 bad card. So people are playing sometimes 1 Gamma and 3 Epsilon or 2 Epsilon to have a little bit of a better ratio of cards, because a lot of their power cards are spells. So if you can hand trap them with like an Imperm or an Ash, and then they try to extend with original or Wanted or another card, you could potentially hit that with either of these cards and kind of pair these together one way or another to kind of hit those cards from going off. And then how to counter. So again, these are more the board breaking options. Again, you have Bell, DD Crow, Ghost Ogre, and Cypher Gear Gamma. Kind of talked about these already, but these can be options if you're kind of considering this more for going second as a 6 card that can be playable, versus some of the other cards we talked about, they kind of want to be drawn earlier. Like for example, these cards are better as going 6 card, where the Bestial is much better if you open it in your 5 card hand. Because once they already set up their combo, you can still get the Bestial onto the field to maybe apply some pressure. But if they already have Princess in the grave, they can pop the Bestial. You don't really have anything super good to hit since it's mostly a fire deck, but you can get rid of something. So again, these are kind of a little bit better of an option when going second, and you draw these as your 6 card. Ghost Ogre isn't generally, again, a very good hand trap for stopping your opponent's plays when you're pairing it with other cards on the field. There is maybe some potential areas you can hit them with a Ghost Ogre that could be helpful to stop their board from extending out as much. But Ghost Ogre is more of a card kind of similar to DD Crow or Ghost Bell. It's more of a card that's being used either later in the combo, and in this case, people are mostly using this as ways to break the board. So it's almost more looked at as a board breaker going second to be able to stop a Apollousa. Since you activate a card, they negate, you can chain this, destroy the Apollousa, and your card goes through. Or you can potentially stop a Flame Burst from bringing a card back by Ghost Ogreing it. So there are some ways you can kind of use this more as a going second card. Alright, so next we have how to counter. So this is going to be kind of part 2 of the how to counter. We're going to be focusing more on board breakers. So it's usually easier to stop the board than to break the board plus follow up. So that's kind of why a lot of people are going again for that hand trap approach. But then you have the hand trap mini game. And this is kind of who gets to play first. When you're just, I drew 2 starters and 3 hand traps, and you drew 2 hand traps, 3 starters, and like I play my starter, you hand trap me. I play my extender, since the deck is pretty much all superior starters. You extend out, they hand trap you again, you're like, I can't play, your turn. Okay, then you try to play and they hand trap you, and it kind of becomes this game where you more or less can just show each other your hands and be like, oh yeah, you got 1 more starter than me, or I don't have enough hand traps to stop you, so yeah, you won this one. And that's pretty unfortunate and not a fun way to play. And it's almost kind of like the Maxi mini game in Master Duel that a lot of players play, where once you get max seed, it's like, what do? Do you try to make a small board? Do you do nothing and not get them a draw? Do you can your deck play through Maxi? And this more or less ends up becoming kind of that situation where it's just you're having non-games because you're just getting hand trapped into the ground. And then you have cards that are countering it, cross out and called by. So in hand trap heavy formats, these are being cited or mained sometimes to be able to play through hand traps going first, which now means you need like 2 to 3 at a minimum to be able to stop your opponent, which makes it even harder. Right, so we're just kind of looking over kind of countering hand traps. So we have some counter cards you can consider. So again, the cards we talked about, Called by the Grave and Crossout Designator, these are the cards that people are using to kind of stop hand traps right now. But there are some ways you can actually play around these cards. So maybe if you're playing Bell, that can stop Called by the Grave. On the Master Duel format, they have Called by at 2 and Crossout at 1. So Bell can be a way to actually, make sure your Maxi resolves. Maybe your opponent's playing, you Maxi them, they Called by the Grave, you Bell them. In our form, we don't have that. So that's one reason why Bell isn't played as much. But the other thing is, Bell can be good against Labyrinth. It can be good against some of the recursive cards like Princess or other decks. So depending on the deck you're playing and what you're weak to, maybe you are going to consider playing Bell for its multi-purpose utility. Lancia is another card. Now this can only be used during your opponent's turn, but if you're like hand trap your opponent and they cross out you and you Lancia them, they can't banish any cards. So that's going to make it where, the crossout's going to fizzle. Maybe that hand trap was enough. Maybe you have 2 hand traps on Lancia. So again, Lancia could potentially be a card to play because maybe you're trying to play around cards. Like your opponent, trying to use a board breaker like Soul Exchange to banish your grave, you can Lancia them. Maybe Evenly Match is really popular. Again, Lancia can be a play for that. Maybe you play against a lot of Flunder because that's a pretty popular anti-meta deck. Lancia is decent against that deck. So, again, this could be maybe a way to kind of counter cards. If you're weak to Soul Exchange, maybe you play Lancia. Maybe your meta has Lancia a better card, so it's something to play. And then you have Nibiru and Imperm. So Nibiru doesn't go to the grave, and Imperm isn't a monster. So even when it goes to the grave, it can't be called by the grave, so it has to be hit with crossout, which really is only good when you have a lot of cards that you can potentially hit. So either a mirror match or you're playing a lot of tech cards like hand traps that you can potentially single out to keep playing. Again, that's some ways to play, and also Imperm plays through talents. So you can't just rip one of your other cards if you start with Imperm. And then we're going to look at simplified game states. So one thing that's pretty important right now is, when you're playing in a really hand trap heavy game state, it can be important to be able to play it once the game's simplified. And some of these cards and combinations is like you get hit with the Diabellstar and they hand trap you. Well, let's say you have your own hand trap in hand, you can normal summon Ash, go into Barrone, now you have a negate for your opponent's turn you can play. And Barrone can potentially cycle itself out for another card, getting you Witch again, and trying to get your plays going. So there are, ways you need to think about. If I get hand trapped, can I do something to kind of slow my opponent down? If I can hand trap them, to kind of gain the duel back. People like Pack, and I think some of his YCS decks were playing Typhon as another kind of board simplify playing card. And again, we've seen Bistiodes kind of serve that same role. And this is something that Fenrir has served a lot in previous formats, but I think due to Princess being so popular, we're not really seeing Fenrir played as much. But still, it can be a solid card. And then we're going to kind of talk about, the different options for board breakers. So we have main deck board breakers. So if you aren't taking a main deck approach to board breaking, and there's other ones you can play, but I think these are kind of the most common, you want to generally try to stick to board breakers that are good going first and second, ideally. You don't want to have too many that are just good going second, because if you go first, you might draw a bunch of dead cards. Again, I think one of the best ones this format, if you are taking a board breaker approach, is talents. You can rip cards if they hand trap you, you can steal monsters, really good. Cosmic is kind of interesting because originally in the format it was looking to be really good, but now that we've seen people lean more towards the pure version of the deck, when they set up their line where they have Flame Burst and the field spell, they can play around Cosmic. But Cosmic is still, I think, seeing some play due to the fact that people are playing some side deck cards we're going to get into later, like Floodgates. And Cosmic can be good for getting rid of those floodgates, which are going to lock you out from playing. Enemy controller can be another nice option because it lets you dodge targeting effect negation, which is really good. You can dodge cards, like Imperm or Effect Veiler if your opponent has hand traps in hand when you're playing, and you can also steal their cards. So if they go for Apollousa, which is really popular at the beginning of the format, you could steal an Apollousa and use the Apollousa to negate their own effects, which is huge. Or maybe also potentially dodging a hand trap. So that can be a really big payoff. And then maybe people are more going into SP. So that way when you target, their monster, they can banish the SP in another monster to make it so you have nothing to take. So again, people might be playing around this card, but overall a solid card. Droplets, just another good way, potentially dodging, targeting effect negation when you go second. And also a solid card to set going first to negate their cards. Generally good in decks that only need one card to play or cards that have good discard. But again, this can be nice, especially against the pure version. You can, send a monster and another card and potentially negate, their field, which is nice. And also this deck uses, some quick play spells like with Wanted or other spell cards. You can activate your spell card, if they have a response to negate, then you can activate droplets, sending the card you already activated. So there are some nice synergies, I think, with droplets in the deck. And then Super Poly, I don't think Super Poly is the best card to play. It is decent. It's just not as good as it was in other formats. Generally, Super Poly in formats where it's really good just breaks the board on its own. Like a one card board breaker, they can't respond to it. You usually fuse both of their monsters away. It's really good. Now in this format, you can go into Mud Dragon, but there are ways to kind of play around it. So I think Super Poly with another card can be decent as a board breaker. So again, if you're playing all these board breakers, when you pair them out together, they're pretty good. Just one probably isn't enough. So there are ways they can even play around it when you set it going first. And then the next option are side deck board breakers. These are like Soul Release, Magical Spring, Shaddoll Fusion, Triple Tactics Thrust, or Fantastical Dragon Phantasme. These are cards that you're probably going to be siding because they're good in the fire matchup and maybe some other matchups as well. But you're not going to main deck them because they're not going to be as good all around. You know, the first cards we looked at, these are kind of good generic board breaker cards that you'll be pretty happy with no matter what situation you're in. You know, these are cards that you're going to really want to side. You know, Soul Release, Banishing Their Grave, Magical Spring, drawing you into a lot of cards, potentially more board breakers. Shaddoll Fusion can be a nice way to board break. Thrust can get you into other cards. You know, it generally probably would be maybe Shaddoll Fusion or Talents or something. I don't think Soul Release is as good when it's not the like in your opening hand of 6 cards going second. It still is something you can potentially thrust for as well. And then Fantastical Dragon Phantasme. I think this generally right now is much better in a board breaker approach because one, it gives you targeting protection from Princess, so they can't pop your monsters and get Princess out into the field. Also lets you draw into more board breakers. You know, I think this card can be good in hand trap decks too, when you don't have to hand trap right away. You know, the problem is that this deck usually want to stop it by stopping their initial like first card they play usually or second card. In this type of deck, you kind of got to wait for them to play into the card, hit Phantasme, and at that point they've already got so much onto the field, drawing it to hand traps, then it's kind of too late. I think ideally if you want to play Phantasme, you want to wait and use it when you're in a board breaker approach, so that way those cards you draw into later are good. You have the body on the field, targeting protection. I think really good card as a side deck card in a board breaker deck right now. Shaddoll Fusion can be a nice way to board break, either going into the Fire Shaddoll monster, using Poplar and Ariel to banish cards from their grave. You know, chain block with the Poplar if they're trying to use Apollousa to negate the Ariel. You can summon out the Krista. When Krista goes to the grave, Shaddoll Fusion comes back to hand. And because it's properly summoned, you can potentially bring that card back with the Princess. And now you have a monster negate summon that is nice to use. So you can also use Apollousa to kind of board and chain block as well in a similar way, using like Ariel to banish, you know, maybe Dragon to pop the spell and trap. You know, they can negate that spell and trap pop. You know, you can summon Apollousa and negate that. So again, Shaddoll Fusion as a going second card, as one card, trades with a lot of interaction, which is why it's nice. The nice thing with board breakers is they tend to be more efficient. Can you break the board and prevent follow-up though? That's the most important thing. With hand traps, you kind of need to draw multiple. You have less cards in hand since you only get 5. Usually board breakers are a little bit more efficient. A lot of times one board breaker can do the job in a lot of formats where you generally would need 2 hand traps. You know, the other thing, is it consistent enough? Is one board breaker enough? Or do you need 2? And I think that's kind of one of the issues too. A lot of times one board breaker can be enough, but right now I think you do need to draw 2. So you still have to have a good amount of room or solid engine that can push through with the help of a board breaker. And then there's also the concern of anti-spells. Some people are side decking anti-spells, some people are side decking summon limit. And I'd say right now we're leaning more towards summon limit because less people are taking the board breaker approach. But if we do switch more into a board breaker approach, anti-spell can really shut off a lot of these board breakers. And you really need quick play spell board breakers to play. And sometimes depending on the setup, sometimes the quick play spell ones aren't good enough. We're going to kind of look at some of the issues here. So again, anti-spell versus board breakers. Cosmic, you're going to have to force that out and probably use it on the anti-spell or hit something else right away. But again, Cosmic isn't as good in the pure deck is an option. And then I say for anti-spells, if you're playing the Fire King version, they have to decide, do I want a Cosmic the anti-spell to get rid of that so it's not on the field? In case you have other spell cards to use. Or do you go after the island to, break the board for the Fire King deck so it'll nuke their board? Maybe get rid of an Apollousa or other cards. And they might flow into stuff, but it's still going to take a lot of interaction. But then do you need your spell cards to play? So it kind of creates this weird kind of dilemma. And then again, enemy controller, we talked about how you have to have a monster on field. So if they shotgun this, even though this is a quick play, you don't have anything to tribute. Talents is a normal spell. So if they shotgun anti-spell, you can't play it until the next turn after you set it. And again, Soul Release, another very good side deck board breaking card that people might be able to kind of counter side you with the anti-spell. And then when you look at the engine for the deck, which is another thing to consider, Bonefire, a superior starter and extender, they can't use. Original, they can't extend with because it's a normal spell. Temple and Fire King Island, they can't use to extend and make plays. So again, this also does hurt a lot of the engine and not just the tech cards and the board breakers. And then when we look at, some of the countering, so when we look at board breakers, can they counter some of these board breakers? So for example, Super Poly, they can go into Mud Dragon, but there are ways to kind of counter this. Again, destroying the Kieran with the Runics can non-targeting pop the Mud Dragon. There's ways that they can just still OTK you with Zelantis, or they could use Zelantis as a way to kind of play around the board breaker. Originally, people were ending on boards the Ambler Whale and the Flamber's Dragon, that could be super polyed. Now what people are doing is they're potentially going for the World's Is Resilence Apollousa line, or even here you could just, instead of the Ambler Whale, put the Zelantis on the board, and now you don't have a board that can be super poly. And we're also seeing even the Snak-Eye version of the deck countering super poly. So again, this was kind of the more original 2-card combo board that they would make. So you can get super polyed here with the 2 darks on field from a dragon, and then you can just call fire and they can't bring out princess. And this deck I think will have a little bit of a harder time playing around the mud dragon, but I think could still win if that's your only board breaker. Or what you can do is a lot of times people would bring out the Formula Synchron and then sync away with the Flame Burst to get the bodies, and then you have Baron and you have Bortle Savage, which is 2 negates that are Omni negates, but then they would get super polyed into Dracoid Quest, which is also a decent super polyed target versus Vanadium, but really haven't seen a lot of Vanadium in this format. But now people are kind of playing around that, where they're kind of going for this board where the only thing you can really do is the Panzer Dragon to kind of get rid of these. Even if you super poly for Panzer Dragon and you get rid of the Bortle, the Formula Synchron, so they don't get the Omni negate, they don't get to go into Barrone to floor, they're still gonna have the Snak-Eye field spell to play around Cosmic or other cards. So you're gonna have the IP and the Flame Burst that can go into like an SP. They can go, Flame Burst, bring back multiple monsters, get a lot of follow up. They have Princess Engraved. There's still so much even with the super poly, and you gave up the super poly and a discard to be able to use it. And they still have so much that they can do and so much follow up they're gonna get. The other thing too is I used to think super poly was pretty solid going first, since you can kind of super poly their cards away and kind of disrupt them as they go later into their line. But now what some people are doing is they're actually going into, Ash into Poplar, search original, and then, before they make their play, what they'll do is if you don't super poly them right there, which you'd have to make Garua, and you'd have to discard a card and, they still follow up. And what they'll do is they'll go into Nightmare Phoenix with the 2 monsters. They'll trigger the Nightmare Phoenix and the Poplar. The Poplar will go to the Spell and Trap Zone. Nightmare Phoenix, if this is the only card you have set, can snipe the super poly. You don't have anything really to super poly unless you're using your own board. So now there's only 1 monster on the field. They got rid of the super poly, and then they can just play with the original, sending the Poplar in the Spell and Trap Zone, get Oak, maybe bring back Ash, and then send the monsters, get Flame Burst. You can keep making plays. As a board breaker, this card does have some play around, and it's not a blowout like it normally is. The pure version of the deck, they have Temple and Flame Burst setup that we talked about that plays around it as well. You can see here, this was kind of more of the original line people would go for, maybe with like the Fire King deck originally. And now, we're seeing people, again, using that Unicorn, put the card back and playing around Cosmic. With the pure version, it's kind of the visual to kind of show it. Here's the situation. You got the Field Spell and the Flame Burst. They'll just get the IP out either way. So you're going to have like, Imperm on the Flame Burst and then Cosmic, the Field Spell, or Cosmic, the IP. And then we have Talents. So some people are playing around this. Talents is really nice when people are going for Apollousa, because you could steal the Apollousa, and especially if it's like for 3. A lot of people now are going for like 2 material link Apollousas. So that way you burn one of the negates and they'll only have 1 negate and it's a weak monster. Just giving you like an extra 2 negates, because if they have 3, they'll have 2 left. Your version of the deck can go for Borrelode Savage Dragon, which is an Omni negate, or the Baronne de Forge, which is an Omni negate. Stop Talents. And some people, instead of going for Apollousa, are going for SP Little Knight. So that way, they can banish a card on the field on summon, and then if you try to Talents, if they only have 2 cards, they can just remove their cards from the field, and you don't get to take anything. And if they can live, they're going to get those cards back, probably have some follow-up to keep pushing with, other card interactions they can end up using, either hand traps in hand or cards in grave. So some people are playing around Talents by more going for SP. And some people are playing around Talents by going to Goddess. And Goddess is only affected by cards that target, and Talents doesn't target. If you do go into Goddess, they can't steal the Goddess. And now you have a special summon from Grave Negation with the Goddess you can also use. Again, a really good, kind of ways you can play around Talents. Some alternate builds you can play around with is maybe the Sky Striker engine. Joshua Smith used this in a regional he went to and had good success with it and really enjoyed it. You kind of pair this with some of your board breaker cards, which is nice because it gives you extra extension, cards that are good going first and second. They can access you into engine or like kind of your tech cards to break boards. So there's some really nice ways that you can kind of play with these. The Snak-Eye deck can clear your extra monster zone with like Ash or Oak, like sending themselves for cost. You can also use 2 of your monsters to go into Azalea, and that can then tag into Kagari and other Sky Striker cards. You can even get access to your Sky Striker cards potentially without drawing them, which is nice. And then Princess works well with the deck since, you know, you have generally the Princess Snake-Eye cards, but you can also bring back Kagari, and that can bring back other Sky Striker cards as well. But really nice synergy here and some interesting aspects. You can also play the Earth Sky Striker, which gives you a win in time, which is a nice thing to be able to have in a longer tournament. So I think this is definitely a fun version you could play with. I don't think it's as good as the Trap version, but a lot of times kind of having that interaction and everything that the deck offers, I do think it's a solid version to still play. And then we have some of the Sky Striker cards people are playing, you know, the Double Engage, the Drones, the Widow Anchor, and the Shark Cannon. And I think Shark Cannon is a really good card in this format, being able to steal your opponent's cards in mirror matches or banish them from grave to remove them. Plus you could recur these cards. So I do think that this is a solid engine to pair with the Snake-Eye deck. Another alternate build you can probably play is the Runick Snake-Eye deck. I do think potentially Runick's kind of in a weird spot. Originally there's a lot of Cosmic, potentially people playing Bell to counter Banshee cards from Grave, Ash, you know, all those kind of hurt it, but I do think the Runick Snake-Eye version is pretty cool. You can kind of play it as a board breaking approach, being able to get Curses, Flashing Fire, Destruction, all decent cards that you could kind of pair together as solid grind game. It might be one of the few decks that can grind with the standard Snake-Eye versions of the deck and maybe live. But again, the hard thing with I think this version of the deck is you don't get your battle phase. So you do have to be able to live and make sure you don't get OTK'd. And I think that's going to be the hard part of the Runick deck. But you are going to have a really nice grind game between the 2 engines. And I think it does look like a lot of fun to be able to play. Another nice aspect of the Runick engine with the deck is that I don't think it's going to have the hand trap mini game problem that other Snake-Eye decks are having when they are using hand traps. Because this deck is going to play through hand traps like crazy. Because the Snake-Eye cards by themselves generally tend to play through a hand trap on their own. And then when you add the Runick cards on top of it, you're going to be playing through hand trap really well if that's the approach people are going for. And you're going to be able, you know, to pretty much make your opponent just throw away cards for no reason. And they're just not going to be able to keep up with the resource generation you're getting. And then the last thing we're going to cover is side deck cards. So these are some of the popular ones people are playing. We have Summon Limit and Anti-Spell as kind of floodgates of the format. We have Solemn Strike, you know, another card just to be able to negate hand traps or to stop an Ash. And just kind of removing it from the field, you know, not letting your opponent get their play started. Toss-out Designator is really popular right now since we're in a pretty heavy hand trap format. And some people are even playing Delta as another hand trap. The big thing is you can stop a lot of the kind of power spell push cards that are part of their engine, like Original. And then we're going to talk about some side deck cards that you can play in a board breaker approach, which I think is nice. Again, I think Thrust is a pretty cool card that you can play as a board breaking approach. I think one thing to consider that Josh did in his profile and was talked about in his stream was playing the Black Goat Laughs. The nice thing with this is that it's a decent send. If you send it to the graveyard with the Black Witch, it's immediately live that you can use. Also, if you get hand trapped and you thrust into Black Goat and you hit Ash in a mirror match, that pretty much shuts off their deck from playing. You can also side deck into cards like Different Dimension Grounds, which skips their turn. So if they skip your turn by hand trapping you, you skip their turn and play again. You can also go for cards like Dimensional Barriers, so if you're playing decks like Branded, you can go for this, which is a popular deck this format. And you can also go for cards like Thrust to kind of hit your opponent's deck. If you're playing Pistiles or other cards that summon monsters, you can Thrust to look at their hand and steal their starters or their hand. Alright, so that covers kind of why the Snake-Eye deck is good. We kind of covered all the components, went through a lot of things in depth. Let me know what you guys think of the video. I know it's pretty long, and if you did like all the visuals and it kind of helped you understand things, let me know what you think of that.